In this story, we see two men walking away from Jerusalem. They're dejected, disturbed by recent events, and probably just trying to return home. After the eruption of Jesus into their lives and the excitement and change of pace and of focus, they're trying to scrabble back towards whatever was normal for their lives. They've decided not to lock down in Jerusalem with the other disciples, for whatever reason. Perhaps they've given up on the cause, or perhaps they were just on the outskirts of the group and so weren't invited into the house in Jerusalem in the first place. Or perhaps, after a long time journeying with Jesus, they just want to see their family. Jesus appears among them, clearly looking very ordinary, but somehow unthreatening. Even though the disciples are scared for their lives, they open up to Jesus on the road. Let him journey with them and trust Jesus with their story. They tell Jesus their story, the story of the disappointment of the failure to redeem Jerusalem, and the disturbing story, which they didn't believe, that Jesus had been revealed to some of the women as not being dead. Jesus obviously enjoys talking to both of them and knows the pair quite well. At times in this conversation, Jesus is downright facetious and teasing, having the conversation without revealing himself and mocking them for their lack of knowledge of the Old Testament. And then, Jesus answers their story with another story. I think it's so tempting to see the New Testament as something completely alien to everything that comes before it. But in this story, The Road to Emmaus, Jesus tells the pair on the way to Emmaus the whole story from creation onwards as an epic love story between God and the world that God willed into being. It starts with a creation story like none other at the time. A God who creates the world in love, out of a longing for something to love. This is completely like all the other creation stories at the time. For example, the Babylonian myth, which has the world being the carcass of a defeated seven-headed monster killed by the gods. But in the Jewish story, God creates and remains with humanity, journeying with the homeless Israelites, struggling to free them, and eventually doing so when they become slaves in Egypt. Throughout, God feeds and provides for them in the wilderness, and refuses to be contained or limited like their idols. When the Israelites choose kings to rule them, God is there too. God speaks through the prophets. Now today we tend to look at prophecy as something that tries to predict the future, like tarot cards. But the Israeli cultural tradition is not of mystical soothsayers, but of threateningly outsider-type people who stand at the gates of the city and proclaim when the rulers and the rich of the land forget the poorest, when they forget to provide for the widow, the orphan, the labourer, the foreigner. It's quite a testament to Jewish society that this hectoring prophet, who exists to remind the king and the rulers of God's love and desire that the lowest and the poorest are cared for, was an official office. And prophets were housed and fed by kings, despite the fact that they mostly existed to criticise kings and rulers and riches. This again is unlike the traditions of prophets we see in neighbouring Egypt, where prophets are people who tell the people how great the king is doing. Can you imagine Boris Johnson today paying Greta Thunberg to take up residence opposite number 10 and hold him to account? You bet you can't. So, in all of this, we see above everything God's longing that the poor are fed, that they are cared for and accepted into society. Somehow, this message of God's love and longing for the hungry to be fed is a message that needs saying time and time again in our story as well as theirs. And in Jesus, on the cross, God died and suffered like a common criminal. He did not offer a grand armed resistance or a great show of power. Jesus did not answer wrong for wrong, but died like a poor criminal. You can see the disciples raising their eyebrows and assuming all is lost, because this was a man that they were coming to believe was God, and he did not die in the way that we want God to die. God died in a court where they had no interest in trying him fairly, but sought to find any reason to kill and convict him. Perhaps here, Mark's trial scenes speak most eloquently into our own century, to the contemporary horrors of the dissolution of law. You can hardly say that issue has gone away, either in America or in Britain. The case of Stephen Lawrence comes fast to mind. This is the world of the door broken in at 5 a.m. by the police, the interrogation block, the questions you can't understand, which you can't guess the right answers to because there are no answers that are the right answers that will free you. The hustling from place to place in sealed vans, the wrapped bundle dropped by the side of the country road. Calm and stonily, the authorities state their case. He was guilty of extensive tax offences. He was in a disturbed state of mind at the time of the arrest. No, we can't guarantee to supervise all prisoners all the time. Yes, it would be outrageous to make political capital of this by suggesting that government employees were in any way involved. No appeal will be considered. Interference by foreign governments would be most unwelcome. Sentence was already passed years ago. Administrative complications have delayed the execution, and we're not interested in their innocence now. It's irrelevant that this man has been described as mentally disabled. His race was immaterial to our decision. Our age, our time, has virtually normalised these nightmares and hugely increased the resources that can be used for surveillance. Just as it's our own age that has made such practices alarmingly common for some categories of supposed offenders, even in countries with healthy legal traditions. If the scenes I've sketched above seem to belong in distant countries with barbarous governments, reflect for a moment on the experience of those charged with nothing more than illegally entering Britain in recent years. This is where the meaning of Jesus' trial and death becomes clear, where we see what truth is that this trial establishes. Jesus, before the high priest, has no leverage in the world. He is denuded of whatever power he might have had. Stripped and bound before the court, he has no stake in how the world organises itself. He is definitively outside the system of the world's power and the language of power, and he's going to die because that's what the world has decided. It is at this moment, and at this moment only, that he speaks plainly about who he is. He names himself with the God of Israel, the great I Am, and tells the court that they will see God, the human one, seated at God's right hand, coming in judgment. Humanity does not live in this world of insane authorities, but with God, when God's judgment arrives, it will be in the unveiling of a true human face, as opposed to the masks and caricatures of the high priest's world. And when Jesus walks along the road to Emmaus with the disciples, he explains how it is possible that someone who could be God might die like a common criminal. In the words of Moses and the prophets, he reminds the disciples that in God's love for the world, throughout the whole love story between God and creation, God has always chosen to be with, to side alongside, the poorest, the weakest, born from a line of prostitutes, barren old women and penniless foreigners. God died, as God has always lived, because in our world, the multiple layers of injustices do not allow the poorest and the weakest to live and flourish. Here, Jesus reminds the disciples on the way to Emmaus, something they knew but didn't see, that the God they had walked with and begun to recognise in Jesus, the same God who loved and created the world, and who heckled the kings through the prophets to remember the poor, was never a God of the strong or humanly powerful, but a God who chose as his people slaves and outcasts. Now they begin to see, but still they don't recognise Jesus until he breaks bread with them. There is another similar story in John's Gospel where they only recognise Jesus when he cooks breakfast for them. I like to think that this is because Jesus, like the God who fed the Israelites manna in the wilderness, was a massive feeder, feeding his ragtag bunch of disciples because he is a God who longs to see the hungry fed. And in the resurrection we see clearly, perhaps for the first time, that God's way is not one of human power, but of weakness, which God promises will be transformed. And yet, even today, how badly we could do with the prophets and Jesus to remind us of the poorest. While God promises that it is weakness and poverty that will be transformed into what God sees as strength, and we see that in the promise and the excitement of the resurrection, in this pandemic today, it is the poorest, the weakest, those stuffed together in tiny housing, those whose multiple disadvantages have always led them to die earlier, often unnoticed by the rest of us. Those poorest and weakest are mostly likely to be affected by this pandemic as they already live on a knife edge. And perhaps, just perhaps, we're beginning to notice, to value the poor, because anyone could be poor right now. It's a climate where any business can fail, anyone can lose their job. At the local food bank, you see people you would never have seen there before. And there is, at the moment, this huge and exciting sense of solidarity, of local communities coming together to care for the most vulnerable and clap for people we would never have clapped for before. Carers, rubbish collectors. And we call people key workers, invaluable workers we cannot cope without, delivery drivers and factory workers. In the resurrection, relationships are transformed, people are changed, systems of injustices are promised to be overthrown, and eyes are open. I think perhaps the most important thing to do now is to ensure our eyes stay open, that we continue to live in the resurrection and see weakness as strength and value the poorest and ensure that they're included as God would have wanted them to be. We need to ensure that a clap for carers is not the end of it, just a clap, and that our newfound appreciation for care workers leads to fighting to ensure that this minimum wage, hard, physical labouring job is reformed, revalued as a reflection of where God would be in our world, doing the dirtiest work, managing physical hygiene, caring for the oldest, the weakest, the most damaged in our society. We need to take our current experience of being on the brink, which we all have at the moment, and transform the world so the brink is not a place of death, but a place of resurrection, as God promises it will be in the resurrection, and reimagine what a restored world would be. If we walk with God, this will not lead us back to the old normal and routine of how things used to be, and we should not long for that. But God will remind us, like the apostles on the road to Emmaus, of God's love and advocacy for weakness in a world that only values strength. So perhaps when we say Alleluia and glory in the resurrection today, what we should really glory in is a vision of a world where relationships and systems of injustice are transformed through the resurrection, through Christ. Amen.